In a gloved palm, under the hard white light of a laboratory, lies a splinter of bone smaller than the last joint of your little finger. It is gray and unremarkable, one of more than 2,000 nameless chips dug from the floor of a single cave in Siberia, and for years no one even knew what animal it came from. And then scientists read what was written inside it, letter by chemical letter, and what they found rewrote the boundary lines of the entire human family. Her mother and her father were two different kinds of human, not two tribes, not two races, but two separate branches of humankind, as distinct from one another as a wolf is from a coyote. And somehow, against every rule we ever wrote about where one kind of human ends and another begins, they met and made a daughter. 90,000 years ago, she was real. Her name for tonight is Deni, and she is about 13 years old, living in the Altai Mountains of southern Siberia, in a cave that human hands have sheltered in for 100,000 years. To understand who she is, you first have to understand something we forget too easily, that in her world, our own kind was not the only kind of human walking the earth. For most of the human story, there were several kinds of us at once, cousins on separate paths, and Deni is the living not where two of those paths tie together. To the west lived the Neanderthals, stocky, powerful, cold-hardened, the great survivors of Ice Age Europe, with heavy brows and barrel chests and brains as large as our own. We know their faces well and their tools and their graves because we have found their bones for a century and a half. They are the humankind we picture when we say the word caveman. They buried their dead and cared for their sick and hunted the largest animals of the Ice Age up close, and for a long time we imagined they were the only other humans there had ever been. They were not brutish or stupid, whatever the old cartoons taught us. They made fire, wore worked hides, and may have painted on cave walls tens of thousands of years before our kind arrived in Europe. For 300,000 years they were the masters of the frozen north, and then mysteriously they were gone, but not, as we now know, before they left something of themselves behind in others. But to the east lived another people entirely, the Denisovans, and they are one of the strangest discoveries in all of science, because we came to know them before we ever saw their faces. The entire people was first defined not from a skull or a skeleton, but from a scrap, a child's finger bone, from this very cave, that gave up a genome unlike Neanderthal or modern human. For years they were a ghost lineage, a whole branch of humanity known almost entirely from genetics, essentially a complete genetic portrait of a people whose face no one on Earth could draw. They ranged, we now believe, across a huge sweep of Asia, from the frozen mountains of Siberia to the tropical forests of the far southeast, and yet they left almost no bones behind that we have ever found. A whole successful humankind, spread over half a continent for tens of thousands of years, reduced in our records to a finger bone, a few teeth, and a scrap of jaw. Picture that for a moment, an entire kind of human, real enough to leave DNA in living people today, and yet for years little more than a genome with no skeleton, a name attached to a shadow. And this one cave, high in the Altai, sat precisely on the frontier between the two vanished worlds, the far eastern edge of the Neanderthals, the western edge of the Denisovans. It was one of the rare places on the whole continent where two kinds of human, on their long separate journeys across tens of thousands of years, could actually cross paths, and at least once they did. So picture the meeting that lies behind that splinter of bone, the human moment the genome forces us to imagine. A Neanderthal woman from the western line, a Denisovan man from the eastern, their two peoples separated for hundreds of thousands of years, as different from each other as distinct species. And out of that meeting, across whatever gulf of strangeness lay between them, came a child, Deni, who was in the most literal genetic sense exactly half of each. Now try to imagine growing up as that child, carrying two ancient lineages in equal measure inside one small body. She has her mother's blood and her father's blood in perfect balance, which means she fits neither mold cleanly, perhaps her brow a little heavier than her father's people, her frame a little lighter than her mother's. In a world where a band is a family and a stranger can mean danger, a child who belongs fully to neither side is a genuinely new kind of person, a bridge that had never existed before. Her mother would have carried her into her father's world, or the other way around, learning to live among people who moved differently, sounded different, remembered a different set of ancestors and a different land. And Deni herself, growing up, would have been the only one of her exact kind she ever knew, no brothers or sisters shaped quite like her, no one whose face was the same blend of two worlds. We will never know whether she was cherished as the living link between two peoples, or eyed with unease as one who belonged completely to neither. The bone cannot tell us that. It holds her ancestry, not her days, not the sound of her laugh or the name her mother called her. But it tells us the one thing that matters most, that she lived, that she reached the edge of womanhood, and that two peoples the textbooks once drew as separate species saw no unbridgeable wall between them. Somewhere behind the cold data is a real family, a mother and a father from two different worlds who, whatever else was true, kept a daughter of mixed blood fed and warm and alive for 13 hard winters at the edge of the ice. They saw each other clearly enough to build a life together, at least long enough to make and raise a daughter to the age of 13. And there is one more astonishing thread woven into her blood, one the genome gave up almost as an afterthought. Her Denisovan father himself carried a distant Neanderthal ancestor, far back in his own line. Which means these two humankinds did not meet only once in one strange encounter. They met and mixed and met again across the ages, wherever their worlds overlapped, until the boundary between them was less a wall than a well-worn path. Now step out of the ice age and into the clean white light of the laboratory, because the way we learned all of this is almost as astonishing as the girl herself. In this same Altai cave, archaeologists dug up more than 2,000 bone fragments, anonymous chips and slivers, not one of them identifiable by eye as anything at all. Bag after bag of gray rubble, where any single sliver might have come from a deer, a hyena, a cave bear, or a human, with no way in the world to tell just by looking. So the scientists stopped looking and started reading, using a clever new method that reads the protein signature locked inside bone to sort human from animal. One small splinter out of thousands came back flagged as human, a single needle pulled from a haystack of nameless rubble by chemistry rather than by eye. That splinter is Deni, and when the geneticists pulled her ancient DNA from it and read it through, they found something no one in the history of the field had ever seen before. Reading DNA this old is its own quiet miracle, because after 90,000 years the genetic code has shattered into billions of tiny broken fragments, contaminated with the DNA of bacteria and soil and every hand that ever touched the bone. Piecing that back into a genome is like reconstructing an entire library from a mountain of confetti, and yet, out of the confetti, a single clear and impossible pattern emerged. Her genome is a near-perfect split, and that split is the whole revelation. Roughly half of her DNA matches the Neanderthals, and the other half matches the Denisovans, not diluted, not a faint ancient trace, but a clean, even 50-50 division running all through her chromosomes. And a 50-50 split like that can mean one thing and only one thing, one parent from each of the two peoples, which makes Deni a first-generation child, the direct offspring of a Neanderthal and a Denisovan. She's the only such person ever found anywhere on Earth, the single, direct, physical proof that two kinds of human met and had a family, captured forever in one splinter of bone the size of a fingernail. Sit for a moment with just how improbable that is, statistically, as a thing to have stumbled upon. To find a first-generation hybrid, you would normally have to be extraordinarily lucky, since such children must have been a vanishing fraction of everyone who ever lived in these hills. Unless, and this is the quiet thunderclap hiding inside the discovery, such children were simply not rare at all, and the two peoples mingled so often that catching one was only a matter of time. Of the tiny handful of archaic humans whose whole genomes we have ever managed to recover, one of them turned out to be a direct, first-generation hybrid of two separate species. And that can only be true if the mixing was not some rare freak event, but common, ordinary, a thing that happened again and again whenever these peoples met. Deni does not live to grow old, and the bone cannot tell us why. Perhaps a sickness, perhaps a hard winter, perhaps an accident on the ice or the rocks, whatever it was, she is barely 13 when it takes her, still a girl standing at the doorway of a life she will never enter. Her people would have known her and grieved her in whatever way their kind grieved, and then, as all people must, they moved on with the turning of the season. It is worth pausing on the smallness of her, because she is not a king or a hero or anyone her own world would have thought worth remembering, just a girl who lived and died at the edge of the ice. And yet it is precisely this ordinary, forgotten child who now stands as one of the most important human beings ever discovered because of what her bones were made of. And then her small piece of bone falls to the cave floor and it begins to wait. The dirt covers it and the seasons turn overhead, ice ages come and grind away and go, the great beasts vanish, the Neanderthals vanish, and in time the Denisovans vanish too. Her entire world quietly empties itself out of existence, every face and every people she ever knew erased from the earth, and still the splinter lies there in the cold dark, holding its impossible secret. For 90,000 years, a span so vast the human mind simply slides right off it, nothing happens at all. Every empire that has ever felt ancient to us is a rounding error against a number like that. All of written history would fit into the final thin sliver of her weight. And through all of it, a complete family tree, a mother's whole people, a father's whole people, and the exact moment the two of them crossed, sits folded quietly inside a chip of bone no bigger than a fingernail. Until at last, a gloved hand lifts it out of the dirt, and a machine reads it, and a girl who has been silent for 90,000 years finally gets to tell us who her mother and father were. It is, in its strange way, the longest a child has ever waited to be recognized, 90 millennia in the dark, for the single moment someone would understand what she was. And what she was turns out to be something science had insisted for a long time should not really be able to exist at all. Here is the part that should quietly change how you look at yourself in the mirror. Denny's peoples did not truly vanish, not completely, not all the way, not in the way we usually mean when we say a species is gone. Because when the Neanderthals and the Denisovans met our own ancestors, the very same thing happened all over again. They did not simply fight or flee. They joined, they had children, and their blood ran forward into us. The story we used to tell of our ancestors sweeping across the world and simply replacing every older kind of human they met turns out to be far too clean and far too cold. The truer story is messier and warmer and stranger, a story of meeting and mixing, and folding the older humankinds into ourselves rather than only wiping them away. The Denisovans in particular live on in ways that can be measured in a laboratory today, in the DNA of people walking the earth right now. Across the Pacific, in the peoples of Papua New Guinea, in Aboriginal Australians, as much as 4 to 6% of their entire DNA comes straight from the Denisovans, from Denny's father's people. And that inheritance is not useless junk carried along by accident. High in the thin air of the Himalaya, the gene that lets Tibetans breathe where others gasp and fail was a gift handed down from the Denisovans. When our ancestors first pushed up onto that brutal plateau, the low oxygen should have killed them or their children in the womb, but some of them carried a Denisovan version of a single gene, and it let them live where no one else could. A people who died out tens of thousands of years ago reached forward through time and handed their distant descendants the exact key they needed to survive the roof of the world. A vanished kind of human is still, at this very moment, helping living people survive on the roof of the world, a dead people's gene beating quietly inside the blood of the living. And this one cave, this single hollow in the rock of the Altai, held all three kinds of human across the long dark of the Ice Age. Neanderthals slept here, Denisovans slept here, and in time our own kind, modern humans, slept here too, one roof, three humankinds, sheltering from the same cold under the same stone. They did not all live here at the very same moment, but across the deep sweep of time, this one cave was home, in turn, to three different kinds of human being, each drawn to the same dry shelter and the same running water below. There is no other place quite like it on Earth, a single address in the human story where three of our kinds all left their bones and their DNA in the same cold floor. The hard walls we once imagined between them, separate species, us and them, a clean line dividing one kind of human from another, were never anywhere near as solid as we believed. Denny is the living proof of that, small enough to hold between two fingers, a whole revolution in a fingernail of bone. A girl who belonged fully to neither of her parents' peoples, and so, in the end, quietly belongs to all of us. Because if your own ancestors came from Asia or from the islands of the Pacific, and here's where you should stop and let it land, a little of Denny's father is still inside you, right now, in every cell. Even if they did not, nearly everyone outside of Africa carries a few % of Neanderthal DNA, which means Denny's mother's people are woven into billions of us as well. Two entirely different kinds of human met in a Siberian cave 90,000 years ago, made a family, and left that family in our blood. They never entirely went away. They did not simply vanish into the dark of prehistory. They became us.